My name is Richard Moran. I'm 76 years old, and until recently, I lived in a weather-beaten cabin deep in the woods of Maine, a place so remote the mail truck gave up halfway down the dirt road and honked until I came trudging out to collect it. That place, that land, was all I had left. After Marlene passed away 8 years ago, it became my sanctuary, my prison, and in some ways the last corner of the world where I felt like a man instead of a burden. My children, Jenny and Paul, visited less and less over the years. At first they came up on holidays, bringing their own chaos, their own complaints about the bugs or the lack of Wi-Fi, always watching the clock. But even that faded. By the time I hit 75, they stopped pretending. I wasn't always a hermit, not by nature. I served in the Army, did forestry work most of my life, raised 2 kids with a woman I loved more than life itself. We had a mortgage, barbecues, cable TV, neighbors who waved, fights over bills, trips to the diner where Marlene always ordered coffee, even if she wasn't thirsty. When she died suddenly, a clot in the lungs, the doctor said, quick and painless. It felt like someone had reached inside and yanked out all my moving parts. I sold the house in Augusta, took my pension, and retreated to the only thing I understood better than grief, the woods. Marlene used to say the forest suited me better than most people did. She wasn't wrong. The kids didn't like the move. Jenny said it was irresponsible to live so far from a hospital. Paul asked if I was trying to be a cliché. Old man in the woods with a shotgun and a grudge. Maybe I was. I didn't ask either of them for permission, but I tried to keep in touch. I called on birthdays, sent Christmas cards. I even got a smartphone, one of those giant button models meant for the elderly. Jenny texted thanks once. Paul never responded. They were busy, jobs, kids, stress. That's what Jenny always said. They worried about me, of course. That's what they claimed. But when I needed help replacing a leaky roof, no one showed up. When I broke my wrist clearing out an old tree stump, I drove myself to the clinic, biting down on a rag to keep from blacking out. I didn't hear from either of them for weeks. When I called to say I'd fractured a bone, Jenny asked, "Did you at least learn your lesson?" That was the tone, concern layered over condescension. And still, despite all that, I held on to the idea that I had a family, that maybe the years had made them cold, but not heartless. I believed it until that day in late September, when Jenny called out of the blue. Her voice was unusually chipper, brittle with a rehearsed sweetness that didn't fool me for a second. She said she and Paul had been talking and thought I needed a change of scenery. A weekend getaway, she called it. Somewhere peaceful, but not too far. Just a little break from the woods. "We'll pick you up," she said. "You won't need to bring anything but a light bag. It'll do you good, Dad." I was suspicious. Of course I was. They hadn't offered anything in years without strings attached. But a part of me, a tired, lonely part, wanted to believe maybe they were trying. Maybe they felt guilty. Maybe they remembered I was still their father. I told myself not to be bitter. Maybe this was an olive branch. So I packed a small duffel with a change of clothes, my arthritis medication, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and the thermos Marlene had given me our last Christmas together. The morning they arrived, Jenny stepped out of the SUV in a neat black jacket, designer boots that looked ridiculous on the muddy driveway. Paul didn't even get out of the car. He gave me a short nod from the driver's seat, didn't bother to make eye contact. "You ready?" Jenny asked, smiling too hard. The drive was quiet, filled with the sound of tires crunching gravel and the occasional cough from Paul. They didn't say where we were going. I asked, once. "It's a surprise," Jenny said. "Just relax." So I leaned back, feeling the familiar knot of dread tighten in my gut. After a couple hours, the paved road gave way to gravel, then gravel to dirt, and soon we were deep into a patch of forest I didn't recognize. Paul finally pulled over beside an old ranger access trail. No signs, no other cars, just trees pressing in from all sides like silent witnesses. "Here we are," Jenny chirped, hopping out of the car. "Let's stretch our legs." She opened my door and motioned for me to follow. Paul grabbed my bag from the back and tossed it onto the dirt. "Back in a bit," he muttered. I stood there confused. Jenny pressed the thermos into my hands. "There's coffee in there. You love coffee, right? We'll be back soon, Dad." And then they were gone. Just like that. The SUV reversed, kicked up a spray of dust, and disappeared down the road, its taillights shrinking until they were nothing. I stood alone with a thermos of lukewarm coffee and the sound of crows circling overhead. I didn't panic right away. I waited. Told myself they'd gone to get supplies or scout the trailhead or whatever excuse would make sense of the nonsensical. I waited for an hour, then another. The shadows shifted. The temperature dropped. No signal on the phone. No note. No map. Just me. A 76-year-old man in hiking boots and a light jacket, alone in a part of the forest I'd never seen before. And that was when I realized they didn't forget me. They left me. Deliberately. Like trash. And for the first time in years, I felt something awaken in me. Not sadness, not fear, but something far older, colder, and sharper. Resolve. They thought I'd die out there, or that I'd wander, disoriented, until some ranger or animal found my remains. They thought they could erase me, quietly, neatly, and go back to their lives, free of burden. They thought I was weak. They thought wrong. The first hours passed slowly, like sap dripping from a wounded tree. I stood there motionless, holding that useless thermos in both hands, trying to force sense into the senseless. It had been a long time since I'd let myself feel confusion like that. Not the confusion of misplacing a tool or forgetting a date, but the deep, existential confusion of betrayal so intimate it paralyzes you. I kept replaying their faces in my mind. Jenny's brittle smile, Paul's impatient silence, the mechanical way they handed me my belongings, how Paul didn't even bother to turn off the engine. I knew the forest better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. And yet something about this particular stretch was unfamiliar. Too far north, perhaps, or just too far from anywhere I'd ever had reason to be. There were no trail markers, no cabins, no remnants of campsites or old fire pits. It was, in every sense of the word, nowhere. I did what I'd always done when the world fell apart. I took stock. I had my pocket knife, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a bottle of ibuprofen, a half-full thermos of coffee, 2 granola bars Jenny had shoved into my duffel, and one old man's worth of fading muscle memory. The sun was already dipping past its midpoint. I knew what that meant. Nights in Maine in late September were not forgiving. If I wanted to live through the night without exposure, I needed shelter, warmth, and ideally some sense of direction. I walked. There was a time when my stride could eat up miles before breakfast. That time had passed, but the instincts remained. I looked for dry ground, noted the moss on tree bark, watched the way the light filtered through the canopy. I followed a dry stream bed for over an hour, hoping it would lead to something, anything man-made. It didn't. When the wind picked up, I felt the first real sting of cold. My jacket was good enough for a walk to the mailbox, not for sleeping under the stars in a forest designed to outlive people. I found a cluster of spruce and gathered their fallen branches. I built a crude lean-to and lined the ground with pine needles. It wasn't comfortable, but it was insulation. I wrapped my arms around my knees and leaned back, staring up at a sky too clear for comfort, wondering how it had come to this. I didn't sleep. The forest doesn't sleep, not really. It creaks and rustles and mutters to itself all night, and every sound becomes a question you can't answer. Was that a branch or something stepping? Was that wind or breath? A fox came near once, curious or annoyed. We looked at each other and both decided we didn't have the energy for confrontation. Around 3 in the morning, the temperature dropped hard and I had to pace in circles to keep my legs from going numb. That's when it hit me fully. Not the cold, but the truth. My children had brought me out here to die. That wasn't exaggeration. That wasn't melodrama. That was the blunt reality. No food, no phone, no transportation, no explanation, just a slow-motion disappearance. Maybe they'd even call it a tragedy. Maybe they'd tell the police I'd wandered off. They'd cry on the local news and say I had dementia, say I'd gotten lost in the forest I claimed to love so much. Maybe they already had. By morning, I was sore, hungry, and furious. Not just at them, but at myself. For letting it happen. For believing even for a second that they might have changed. That they might see me as something more than an obstacle to their convenience. Or a source of inheritance they were too impatient to wait for. I knew people like my kids. I'd worked with men like them. Efficient, intelligent, emotionally sterile. They didn't hate me. They just couldn't use me anymore, so I became a logistical problem, a spreadsheet column, an inconvenience. And people like that don't lose sleep over deleting an inconvenience. I gathered my things, such as they were, and began walking west, orienting myself by the rising sun and the remembered direction of the highway we must have taken to get here. I rationed the granola bars, chewing slowly, letting the sugar burn in my bloodstream long enough to keep my legs moving. It was the second day when I found the hunter's blind, a rusted old aluminum stand nailed into a tree with beer cans scattered below. I shouted, hoping someone would be nearby, but no one answered. Still, I knew I was close. Civilization doesn't leave beer cans without a trail. By dusk, I found the old service road. It was overgrown, barely visible, but it had tire ruts, and those ruts meant vehicles. I followed it, legs aching, lungs burning, stomach twisting itself in knots. Just after dark, a pickup came crawling up the path. The driver slowed, rolled down his window, and stared at me like I was a ghost. I must have looked the part, muddy, bleeding from one shin, clothes torn, face crusted with cold sweat. "You all right, old-timer?" he asked. I nodded once. "Got left out here?" I said. He asked no more questions. He handed me a bottle of water and told me to get in. His name was Evan, a local mechanic and part-time trapper. We drove in silence for 20 minutes until we reached a small town with one diner, one gas station, and a sheriff's office. I asked him to drop me at the station. He raised an eyebrow. "Want me to wait?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "They need to see me walk in under my own power." He seemed to understand. "Good luck, sir," he said, and drove away. Inside, a young deputy looked up from his desk and blinked at me. "Can I help you?" he asked, like I was lost, like I'd wandered out of someone else's memory. "I need to speak to someone about a potential crime," I said. "A serious one. And I need to do it before anyone starts lying about who I am." He asked for my name. When I told him, something shifted in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but awareness. He typed something on his computer. "Your kids put out a missing person report yesterday," he said slowly. "Said you had early-stage dementia and wandered off from a vacation rental. Said you might be confused." I almost laughed. "I'm not confused," I said. "I was left. Deliberately. No phone. No food. No way out. They abandoned me. And I can prove it." He leaned back in his chair. "You sure about that?" I nodded. "I'm more sure of that than anything in my life." He glanced at the wall clock. "Sheriff will be in tomorrow morning," he said. Till then, we can get you a room at the inn down the street, on the department's dime. You need a doctor? Later, I said. Right now I need sleep, and then I need a lawyer. He raised an eyebrow. You planning to press charges? Not yet, I said. First, I'm going to get everything back that they tried to take. Then, we'll see what justice looks like. He gave me a key and directions to the inn. As I walked into the cold night air, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Not rage, not pain, not even hope. It was purpose. Quiet, sharp, and absolute. They left me in the woods like trash. But I wasn't trash. I was their father. And now I was coming back. With a court order. Sleep came in patches. Thick and hot, and filled with images I didn't want. Memories of Marlene, holding my hand in that hospital room the night before she died. Of Jenny, as a little girl putting Band-Aids on her stuffed animals. Of Paul in his high. School football jersey acting invincible and smug, of the way they both smiled when they dropped me in that forest, like I was a sack of used clothes being left at a thrift store. I woke before dawn in the lumpy motel bed the sheriff's department had covered, sore and still wearing the same clothes I'd been in for 2 days. My knees ached, my back screamed, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought, if they want to make me look weak, old, and forgetful, I'll show them what real memory looks like. I showered slowly, bandaged the scrape on my shin, and walked down to the diner Evan had pointed out the night before. The waitress didn't ask questions, just poured black coffee into a heavy mug and handed me a laminated menu sticky at the edges. I ate in silence, watching the morning light change through the windows, and rehearsed every detail of what had happened. When I arrived back at the sheriff's office, the older man behind the desk greeted me not with suspicion, but a kind of reserved curiosity. Sheriff Marks, his nameplate said, broad-chested with graying sideburns and a look in his eyes that told me he didn't tolerate much nonsense. He invited me into his office, listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he leaned back and rubbed his chin. That's serious, he said finally. If what you're saying is true, it's more than neglect. It could be criminal abandonment, maybe even fraud, depending on what they've done with your name or finances. I handed him my ID and explained the full context. That my kids hadn't just left me in the woods, but that they had previously manipulated me into giving them access to my bank accounts. That there were whispers in the family about transferring the deed of my cabin, that Jenny had once casually suggested I consider signing a medical's power of attorney just in case something happened, all while assuring me they were looking out for my best interests. Sheriff Marks wrote notes, nodding slowly. You've got grounds, he said, but it'll take more than your word to hold in court. Do you have anything written? Emails? Voicemails? Financial records? I didn't have them with me, of course, but I remembered every line of every conversation. My memory wasn't the one in question, after all. We made a plan. He would run a wellness report and notify the Maine Attorney General's office of a potential elder abuse situation. In the meantime, I would return to my property, collect all relevant documents, and secure any evidence that might prove undue influence or financial manipulation. I called a local cab, rode back into town where a regional bus line could take me halfway home, then connected to another route heading west. The trip was slow, grueling, and unkind to old bones. But every mile I crossed brought me closer to something they didn't think I had left in me. Resolve. When I finally reached the edge of my property, everything looked the same on the surface. The old rust-colored pickup still rusting in the tall grass, the mail still half jammed into the warped mailbox, the air still thick with the smell of pine and memory. But something inside me was different. I walked into my cabin with a sense of ceremony. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a crime scene, a record of a life they'd tried to erase. I dug through the drawer where I kept copies of bank statements, loan documents, and the suspicious power of attorney Jenny had me sign 6 months ago under the pretext of helping pay utility bills online. The more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. They weren't just neglectful, they were strategic, calculated, predatory. I found emails. Jenny had emailed my financial advisor posing as me, requesting balances and transaction authorizations. She must have guessed the password. Paul, it seemed, had arranged for my Social Security checks to be routed into a joint account without ever asking my consent. I had let them into my accounts because they were my children, because I trusted them, and they took that trust and gutted it. I gathered everything, printed records, handwritten notes, copies of forms, and packed them into a folder so thick it barely fit in my satchel. The next day I made an appointment with a lawyer, Judith Lane, recommended by a veteran friend who'd used her for a land dispute. Judith was in her early 60s, razor sharp, no nonsense, and she didn't ask for sympathy. "Tell me what happened," she said, and I did. When I finished, she flipped through the folder silently. "They've set themselves up for something ugly," she said. "If we move fast, we can petition for emergency injunctions. We can have their access to your accounts frozen, notify your banks, and challenge the power of attorney immediately." I signed everything she put in front of me, not because I was vengeful, not because I was proud, but because if I didn't act now, they'd win by inertia. Judith raised her eyes after I signed the last form. "You're not the first client I've had who's been preyed on by their kids," she said. "But you might be the first who fought back early enough to make it count." The next week blurred into motion. Court filings, bank visits, legal affidavits, certified letters, background checks. At one point, I was sitting in the waiting room of my credit union when the manager, a woman named Lisa, who'd known Marlene and me for decades, came out and gave me a hug. "They tried to say you gave them power of attorney because you were losing your mind," she said, voice trembling. "But I told them flat out, Richard Moran doesn't lose anything unless he wants to." That night, I cried for the first time in years, not from grief, but from the quiet, accumulated sorrow of being so easily discarded by the very people I helped into this world. And then came the letter. Jenny's lawyer sent it, cold, clinical, and galling. It accused me of paranoid behavior, of endangering family relations, and hinted that if I continued to pursue legal avenues, they would consider countermeasures, including a claim of incapacity and psychological instability. That's when I realized the depth of their plan. They weren't just going to steal from me. They were going to rewrite me. Turn me into a confused, senile old man, incapable of managing his own affairs, fit to be locked away, forgotten, and harvested for whatever funds remained. I stared at that letter for a long time before picking up the phone and calling Judith. "What are our options?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "We go public," she said. "We take it to court, and we take it personally." And so the battle lines were drawn. Not just legal, but moral. Because this wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't about money. It was about whether a man who had spent his life building, protecting, and loving a family could be tossed aside like a coat gone out of season. They thought I'd die quietly. But I had already buried silence with Marlene. What was left in me now was fire. And they were about to learn that when an old man stands up, it means he's found something worth standing for. It was almost poetic how quiet the courtroom was that morning. The kind of quiet that settles not because people are calm, but because something heavy is about to shift. I sat at the long oak bench beside Judith, dressed in my best blazer, the one Marlene always said made me look like a retired senator. and I waited for the moment that would either restore my name or seal it behind a door, labeled incompetent. Across us, from me sat Jenny and Paul, both dressed like they were attending a funeral, which I suppose in their minds they were, the death of their easy scheme, the end of the story where Dad just faded out and left everything to them. They didn't look at me. Jenny stared at her phone, Paul fidgeted with his cufflinks, and I could feel the heat of their contempt, even from across the room. The judge, a lean woman with iron gray hair and a stare that could crack concrete, called the hearing to order. Judith stood and laid out the case, that I had been deliberately abandoned in a remote wilderness under the guise of a family vacation, that my financial access had been manipulated through a dubious power of attorney, and that my children were now attempting to have me declared legally incompetent using false claims of cognitive decline. She presented our evidence, documents, witness statements, medical records from my recent evaluation by 3 independent specialists, all of whom had confirmed I was of sound mind. She played the audio file of the 911 call Jenny had placed 2 days after abandoning me, her voice trembling as she described me as senile, prone to wandering, possibly dangerous to myself. It was calculated, rehearsed, and revolting. Jenny's attorney stood next, a slick young man in a too-tight suit who spoke with polished empathy, painting me as a man in denial of his aging, a man resistant to help, irrationally suspicious, and, according to him, paranoid. He referenced my choice to live off the grid as a symptom, not a preference. He read excerpts from emails where I had expressed frustration with the bank, with Jenny, with the process of navigating technology. He calls himself a woodsman, the lawyer said with a patronizing shrug, but his choices place him at significant risk. My clients intervened not out of greed, but out of necessity. I watched the judge's face, calm and unreadable, as the lawyer droned on. Judith didn't interrupt. She waited until he finished, then stood up again and said only one thing. "Your Honor, we have video from a highway rest stop 20 miles from the place Mr. Moran was left, time-stamped the morning after he was abandoned. It shows him using a payphone to contact a local sheriff's department. He was cold, exhausted, but coherent, calm, and able to recall the full names and birth dates of his children, his military ID, and his home address. We submit this as evidence not only of his lucidity, but of his resourcefulness under duress." She played the tape. I didn't remember being recorded. There had been a camera mounted above the phone, unnoticed at the time, but there I was, standing in the early morning light, wrapped in an old flannel jacket, my voice clear, my hands steady. I watched Jenny's face twitch when she realized what it meant. When the judge finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She simply stated that there was insufficient evidence to support any claim of incapacity, that the power of attorney was to be considered revoked due to signs of coercion, and that a full financial review would be opened into the actions of Jenny and Paul Moran regarding their father's estate and accounts. The room didn't explode. It exhaled. Jenny whispered something harsh to her lawyer. Paul just stared at the table in front of him. Judith reached over and gently tapped my hand twice, the way someone does when they want to say congratulations without being smug about it. And just like that, the middle point of my story tipped forward, not into victory, not yet, but into a new direction where I had my name back, my signature back, my voice back. Later that day, I walked into the same bank where, a few months prior, Jenny had tried to take control of my account using my own name. This time, the manager greeted me with a firm handshake and called me Mr. Moran again, not Richard, not Sir, but by the full name of a man they now knew was nobody's puppet. We changed the access, closed the joint accounts, flagged the suspicious activity. I filed reports. The wheels of legal motion turned slowly, but they turned with certainty. I was no longer playing defense. I was building my case, piece by piece, not just to protect what I had, but to finally confront the full scale of what had been taken from me. Not only money, but time, dignity, presence in my own family. I called a real estate agent. The cabin was paid off. I didn't want to sell it, too many ghosts, but I knew now I needed to remove every root they had tried to tangle themselves around. I began looking for a new place, a place where no one could come knocking with a power of attorney or a forged document or a tearful story about Dad not remembering things anymore. I found a modest apartment on the other side of the county, overlooking a park near a library. I packed what I needed: Marlene's letters, my journals, my tools, a few pictures of us when we were young and still believed the future would take care of itself. The rest, I left behind like shed skin. I didn't tell Jenny or Paul I was moving. I didn't have to. They would know soon enough. When the bank account pinged empty on their app, when the calls to my old number rang to a disconnect tone, when they realized I had become not just unreachable, but uninterested. That, I knew, would hurt them more than any lawsuit ever could. Because for people like them, power only matters when they know they can reach you. My silence, now deliberate and full of meaning, was a wall they could no longer climb. The thing about people like Jenny and Paul is that they only ever understand one kind of loss, the kind that affects them directly, the kind that threatens their control, their status, their finances, their narrative. When the court ruled against them and the power of attorney was revoked, they didn't disappear like I had hoped. They pivoted, like cornered animals, smart enough to sense they'd underestimated the one person they had always believed was too passive, too worn down by grief and time to fight back. Within a week of the court decision, Judith received a package from Jenny's attorney. Not an apology, not a settlement proposal, but a new claim. This time alleging that I had become a danger to myself and possibly to others, that I had exhibited signs of increasing aggression, delusional suspicion, and obsessive behavior. They cited my decision to cut off contact, to change my address without notifying them, to transfer accounts as erratic and destabilizing, and they attached a 3-page letter from a psychologist I had never heard of, supposedly diagnosing me with early-onset vascular dementia after a phone interview. I remember staring at those pages in Judith's office, my hands flat on her desk, my fingers rigid from the quiet fury I had spent weeks trying to contain. "This is fabricated," I said. Judith nodded. "It's sloppily done, but it's dangerous. If this gets traction, we'll have to mount a full evidentiary defense again. They're not just trying to win. They're trying to smear you so badly that even victory leaves you tarnished." We filed an immediate challenge and demanded that the psychologist appear in court. He never did. Turns out Jenny had paid for an informal cognitive assessment service, one of those pay-to-play digital clinics that produce templated letters for concerned families. It had no legal weight, but the stunt was enough to slow the momentum. Meanwhile, Paul took his own route. He showed up at the bank one morning and tried to withdraw funds from the account I had just closed. When told the account no longer existed, he reportedly became belligerent, shouting that he had rights, that his father was not in his right mind, that there would be legal consequences. They had assumed, perhaps rightly, based on the man I had been for most of my life, that I would back down eventually, that I would tire of the paperwork, the hearings, the effort, and retreat into the kind of frailty they had always counted on. But what they failed to understand was that once you've been abandoned in the forest by the people you raised, there's a limit to how much more harm they can do to you. What's left is resolve, pure and clean and fire-hardened. I hired a forensic accountant. I wanted to know exactly what they had done during those months they had joint access to my funds. What came back was worse than I expected. Jenny had transferred over $18,000 from my savings into an investment account she controlled, masked under a supposed home improvement project for Dad's benefit. Paul had siphoned just over $9,000 through ATM withdrawals spaced across 2 states using my duplicate card. There were restaurant bills, online purchases, flights, hotel stays, none of which had anything to do with caregiving or assistance. Judith filed a civil claim for restitution, fraud, and financial elder abuse. We served them both simultaneously, Jenny at her office during a department meeting, Paul at his home, by a process server who reportedly found him in a bathrobe shouting at his kids. That part gave me no joy, but it gave me closure. The escalation didn't stop there. In a final act of desperation, they tried to involve Adult Protective Services. I received a surprise visit at my new apartment from a caseworker named Tanya, a patient and intelligent woman who had clearly expected to find someone either belligerent or incoherent. What she found was an old man drinking tea, reading a well-worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea, with bills paid, medication organized, and a weekly meal plan posted on the refrigerator. We sat and talked for nearly an hour. She asked questions about my routine, my support network, my understanding of current events. I answered each one with calm and clarity. At the end, she closed her notebook and said, "I hope you don't take this personally. We get calls like this more often than you'd think. Family members trying to flag concerns that are more about inheritance than well-being." I nodded. They don't want to help me. They want to replace me. She gave me a business card and said I could call her any time. She never came back. The tipping point arrived 2 months later when we received a counterclaim from Jenny's lawyer, attempting to freeze all of my remaining assets under the guise of conservatorship proceedings. The claim was filed in a different county, perhaps hoping I wouldn't notice it in time. Judith caught it within a day. We petitioned the court for a dismissal, citing harassment, and attached sworn statements from 3 medical professionals, including my personal physician, who testified to my mental acuity and independent functioning. We also included the full forensic audit showing exactly how Jenny and Paul had used my funds. The court not only dismissed the conservatorship attempt but issued a restraining order preventing them from filing similar motions without prior approval. I thought that might be the end of it. That finally, when faced with the mounting costs, the legal defeats, the public embarrassment, they would let go. But narcissism rarely dies quietly. Jenny began contacting mutual acquaintances, former neighbors, church friends, even distant cousins, telling them I had become paranoid, isolated, ungrateful. She painted me as a man who had lost touch with reality, who was now being manipulated by a shady lawyer and spending his final years bitter and alone. Some people called me confused, asking what was going on. I told them the truth, calmly and without embellishment. Most believed me. A few didn't. But by then, I'd learned the freedom of no longer needing everyone to understand you. I rented a storage unit and moved the last of Marlene's belongings there. Her photo albums, her dresses, her sewing box, the music box she used to wind up on rainy Sundays. I couldn't bear to look at them every day, not while my mind was occupied by legal documents and betrayal. But I couldn't leave them behind either. I began taking walks by the river in the early mornings, nodding to the same old man who fed the ducks, to the woman who jogged with a limp, to the young cashier who smoked on the bench during her break and always offered me a silent wave. These people didn't know my name, and that felt like peace. When the deposition date arrived, I looked Jenny in the eye for the first time in months. She avoided my gaze at first, flipping through pages, talking to her lawyer, pretending to be above it all. But during a recess, when we were briefly left alone outside the conference room, she turned to me and said, You know this isn't what Mom would have wanted. I looked at her without blinking. Don't you dare speak her name like it gives you moral cover. Jenny swallowed hard. She told me once that you were stubborn, that you'd never know when to let go. I stepped closer. She also told me never to trust someone who treats family like property. I didn't understand what she meant until now. Jenny looked away. She didn't reply. That night, back in my apartment, I made a decision. I called the realtor and said I was ready to sell the old cabin. I didn't want to, not really. It held too many years, too many echoes. But I understood something new now. The house had become a battleground, a symbol of ownership and legacy, something my children believed entitled them to dominion over me. Letting it go meant removing their last excuse to circle back, to stake a claim, to pretend they still had something waiting for them. I told Judith to expedite the listing, and within a week we had a buyer. The funds were transferred into a trust I controlled personally, with no co-signers, no secondary access, no inheritors, without my explicit written consent. I had already updated my will, my power of attorney, my medical proxy, all clean, all protected, all witnessed and notarized. I had even named a professional fiduciary to handle things when the time came. My family, as far as I was concerned, ended in that forest. What came after was mine alone. And yet, despite everything, I still found myself dreaming about Jenny as a child. How she used to hold my hand crossing the street. How she cried the first time she broke a crayon. How she used to whisper, "I love you, Daddy," through the door after I tucked her in. I don't think those memories were lies. I think people change. Or maybe they reveal themselves in the pressure of adulthood, when compassion becomes inconvenient and inheritance begins to look more like opportunity than legacy. Either way, I had made peace with one final, unspoken truth, that I would die without reconciliation, without the warmth of family gathered at my bedside, without the sentimental tableau that movies and greeting cards promised. But I would die free, unmanipulated, unclaimed, and unbowed. That, in the end, was enough. It was a Tuesday morning, cold and gray, the kind of morning where light hangs low and everything seems slower than it should be, as if the world itself is taking a breath before something breaks. I was sitting at the corner table of the cafe near my apartment, the one with the warped floorboard beneath the window, and the waitress who always remembered how I took my tea. The newspaper sat unopened in front of me, the steam from my cup curling upward and disappearing just as it formed. I had been waiting all week for the call from Judith, and when my phone finally vibrated against the table, I didn't flinch. I picked it up, pressed it to my ear, and said nothing. Judith's voice was crisp, but there was something in it that tightened my grip around the handle of my mug. "They're contesting the sale," she said without hesitation, "and they've filed an emergency motion to halt the transfer of assets, citing emotional distress and familial obligation." I didn't speak. I just listened. Knowing what came next wouldn't be a surprise, only a confirmation. "They've submitted a new affidavit claiming you're being manipulated into liquidating the estate, in which that you're under undue influence from your legal representation and that the cabin is a sacred family property that must remain in the family's possession. They've even offered to buy out your share for a fraction of the appraised value to prevent it from falling into what they call outsider hands." I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger. Anger had long since burned off, but a kind of contempt so heavy it pinned me in place. Judith continued, "It's a tactic. They're hoping to stall the sale, drain you of time, force you into settlement. But the judge hasn't granted the emergency motion yet. She's called for a final in-person hearing, mandatory attendance for all parties. It's set for Friday." I nodded to no one. "I'll be there," I said. You don't have to convince me anymore. They want to bury me alive in paperwork now that the forest didn't take me. The next 3 days passed like a slow grind through wet gravel. I reread old letters, wrote a new will just for the symbolism of it, and laid out a fresh suit on the back of my couch like a uniform before a final mission. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require choreography. When Friday came, I arrived at the courthouse early. Judith was already waiting. We didn't exchange small talk. She looked at me, nodded once, and led me inside. The hearing room was nearly full, not with spectators, but with officials, clerks, court officers, a reporter for the local legal beat who'd caught wind of the case after the elder abuse filing made its way into public record. Jenny and Paul entered 10 minutes later. Paul wore a suit that fit too tightly around his gut. Jenny a beige turtleneck and somber eyes that tried to project sincerity, but failed under scrutiny. They avoided my gaze. The judge, same woman from before, took her seat and gestured for the clerk to read the motion. The words came out sterile and formal. Request to halt the sale of the property pending further review of familial rights and obligations. Claim of coercion, emotional damage, contested mental state. When the judge turned to Judith, she stood and delivered the blow without ceremony. Your Honor, this is not a motion to preserve a family legacy. This is a desperate attempt to maintain access to property and assets that have already been used without consent, appropriated without transparency, and are no longer available for exploitation. Mr. Moran is not mentally incapacitated. He is not being manipulated. He is here, and he is ready to speak. The judge turned to me. Mr. Moran, she said, her tone even, you have the floor. I stood slowly, not because I was weak, but because I wanted them all to feel the weight of the moment. I didn't use notes. I didn't need them. I am 76 years old, I began, and I have buried the only person who ever loved me without calculation. Since then, I have been treated not as a father, but as an inconvenience. My children, whom I raised with integrity, left me alone in the forest and called it caregiving. They took my money and called it assistance. They forged my intentions and called it protection. I have spent the last year proving that I am not what they say I am. Not confused, not paranoid, not unstable. What I am is free. What I am is tired. And what I want is to never again have to defend my right to exist without being harvested for parts. I turned to face them, for the first time, fully. Jenny, Paul, you abandoned me once, with the sound of tires on gravel. Now you're trying to do it again with signatures and legalese. I'm not asking for your apology. I am asking for silence. Permanent, final silence. Let me go. I've already let you go. There was a stillness afterward that didn't invite rebuttal. Even the air seemed unwilling to stir. The judge folded her hands and spoke with the kind of measured finality that didn't allow room for debate. The court finds no merit in the emergency motion. The property in question is not a sacred family relic. It is a jointly owned asset, legally and fully in Mr. Moran's name, with no restrictions. The claim of coercion is unsubstantiated, and the repeated filings border on harassment. This motion is denied with prejudice, and all associated requests are dismissed. The sale may proceed. Court is adjourned. Her gavel struck wood like a closing door. Jenny stood too quickly, her composure cracking, her mouth forming half arguments she couldn't quite summon. Paul looked at me like I was something he had once believed he could control, and now feared to touch. Judith placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. You won, she whispered. Not just legally. You won morally. I didn't reply. I didn't feel victory. I felt relief. As I stepped outside, The air was sharp and cold, and for the first time in months, I felt like it wasn't trying to cut through me but carry me forward. There was no handshake, no final confrontation, no attempt to mend what had long ago rotted from the inside. They went their way. I went mine. That night, I poured a small glass of Marlene's favorite brandy, sat on my balcony beneath the early stars, and raised the glass to no one in particular. Not to revenge, not even to justice, but to survival, to clarity, to the kind of silence that finally feels like peace. The days that followed moved slowly, not with tension or dread, but with a kind of exhausted finality, as though life itself understood that the storm had passed and was now giving me time to gather whatever was left of myself. I completed the sale of the cabin without fanfare. The funds transferred cleanly into the trust Judith had helped me build, and with that, the last physical tie to the life I had shared with Marlene and the children we had once raised was severed. Not with violence, not even with bitterness, but with the quiet, irreversible click of a door locking from the inside. I didn't cry when I signed the last set of papers. I thought I might. But what I felt instead was distance, the wide, clear space between who I was when that cabin was built and who I had become now. I had not returned to the woods since they left me there. I didn't need to. I had taken something more lasting than vengeance from that forest. I had taken back the shape of myself. I moved into a new rhythm. I woke early, made tea, walked to the park where I sometimes watched the squirrels argue in the trees, and the young parents chase their toddlers across the grass, scenes so mundane they became holy. I volunteered once a week at the local library, shelving books I would never read again but still respected. I learned to cook for one without treating it as a punishment. I spoke to no one from my former life save for Judith, who remained not only my attorney but, strangely, the closest thing I had left to a confidant. She never pried, never offered platitudes, and I never asked her about her own children, if she had any, or whether she too carried disappointments in silence. Sometimes when I stood on my balcony and looked at the horizon the way I once used to scan treetops for signs of fire, I would think about Jenny and Paul. Not with longing, not with grief, but as one thinks about a past illness, a period of fever, that reshaped the body and then left it behind. I did not know where they were or what they did with their days, and I no longer felt compelled to find out. I had made peace with the silence. It was not the cold absence I had feared, but a gentle insulation from further harm. There were no more legal notices, no more hearings, no more questions about my capacity or my assets. What remained was a life reduced but honest, stripped of the illusions I had clung to for far too long. One afternoon in early spring, I visited the cemetery where Marlene was buried. I hadn't been in nearly a year. I brought fresh daffodils and a folding stool, and I sat beside her headstone for over an hour, not speaking aloud, but thinking in the kind of clear, uninterrupted language we used to share when words were too small for what passed between us. I told her everything, not in sequence, but in the rhythm of memory, how they'd left me, how I'd come back, how I'd nearly lost everything except the part of me that refused to die quietly. I told her I had kept her letters, that I had finally closed the door on that house she loved and hated in equal measure, that I had done what I promised, survived with dignity. I imagined her smile then, not approval, not pride, just understanding. That was all I ever wanted from her, and all I had ever wanted from our children. When I rose to leave, I didn't look back at the stone. I didn't need to. She wasn't there. She was in the steadiness of my hands, the precision of my walking stride, the way I folded my laundry and still made the bed with corners sharp enough to bounce a coin. She was in the parts of me that couldn't be signed away or abandoned, that no courtroom could touch. As I walked back to the car, I felt lighter, not because anything had been lifted, but because I had finally set it down. And so my story doesn't end in reconciliation or in triumph, but in quiet persistence. I lived. I kept my name. I kept my mind. I walked out of the woods and into a world that hadn't been kind, but that had at least been honest enough to reveal itself. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't extend it lightly. But I leave no inheritance of resentment behind me, only a record. A trail marked not in blood, but in resistance, in memory, in the unspoken truth that a man is not finished until he decides he is. They tried to finish me, and I said no.